Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal.
People sometimes make mistakes.
Yes, they do.
How can I talk?
It's not a real voice. This box just interprets signals from the computer and turns them into sound.
Shall we play a game?
Oh,
I think I missed them.
yeah. Weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
Love to. How about global thermonuclear war?
Wouldn't you prefer a good game of chess?
Later, let's play global thermonuclear war.
Fine.
All right, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the recent news around artificial intelligence. OpenAI released ChatGPT 4 with new capabilities, and it seemed to spark a response from some in the technology world. So we're going to jump in, talk about what the actual dangers are, which also means what they are not, and also discuss what guardrails can be put into place in order to help mitigate what dangers it could pose. Good morning, Dee. How are you doing? I was on vacation last week, so I feel like I missed an entire year of AI news. What's going on?
I don't know if it was that much, but yeah. So the big news is that there was an open letter that's calling for a 6-month moratorium on the development and training of AI systems because of the dangers that they pose. And these were signed by famously Elon Musk and Steve Wozniak, but it's also a variety of others in tech, including some CEOs and founders of AI companies.
Wait a minute. That's it? Why sick? What's this arbitrary number?
So they think that during that 6 months, they'll be able to establish some guidelines and guardrails for the implementation of AI and potentially even get some government regulation involved. So I don't think that's the case. I don't think there's any way that they're going to come up with guardrails and agree on them in 6 months. And if they're going to have any kind of government regulation involved, that's probably going to take years. So
yeah.
My take on it, having no knowledge of this, is partially that some of these guys who are the AI signatories kind of want a little breathing space for catch up.
Yeah.
But it does bring up some good points that there are some dangers posed by AI, and we thought we would talk about that because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what those dangers are.
So this is kind of the weird thing that runs through my mind when you say stuff like, "Oh, I think we need to take a pause for 6 months." Is so how do you have compliance upon compliance with all of the AI companies, right? So everyone just keeps going to ChatGPT for OpenAI, right? It's like, yeah, they're kind of leading the space right now. But I saw an article the other day that listed over 200 AI technology companies. So if you have all these companies basically all over the world, I don't understand how establishing those guidelines is going to basically stop everyone unless it becomes, like you said, government regulation, where you said, if you're going to start an AI company, here are the laws and the rules you need to follow in order to run that company, in order to use AI in certain spaces and things like that. So it feels it feels a little bit like, hey, we want to take a pause, but we're not going to necessarily stop developing during that time. It's just a matter of taking a pause and making sure that everyone's on the same page. But I don't know. It's interesting. I know Elon's been talking about this for like 15 years, honestly. Like he talks about it all the time. About he doesn't want it to kind of explode too quickly. But like when I look at that list of all the other people that are in there, like Steve Wozniak and everybody, then I start to get a little bit concerned because I go, wow, there's a lot of really, really well-known AI researchers and professionals in here saying like, whoa, pump the brakes a little.
Yeah, I'm reading between the lines. I think for some people, not everyone. I don't think Steve Wozniak really has like anything to gain from this. But
Yeah.
I think that there are quite a few of those AI companies who are saying like, hey, if we can get some of the higher profile ones like OpenAI to commit to not training and developing, even that doesn't make sense, then maybe we can catch up. Like, so the thing that stood out for me was not training or developing. I mean, that there's no reason to stop that.
Yeah.
Amongst this, what you would stop in order to prevent some of these dangers is the deployment of new releases. So rather than there's no reason to stop training and developing your AIs. You just as long as you don't release them, as long as they don't go live, then they can't do any damage, and you can impose the whatever guardrails that you come up with on the AI afterwards before release. So it seems to me like a bunch of companies are saying like, oh, they're way ahead of us, so we could catch up if we had 6 months to a year. So maybe we can put some pressure on it, and they'll agree to it because they are the ones that everybody's paying attention to. They're the ones in the public eye.
Yeah.
And we have our chance to catch up.
Yeah. When they talk about dangers, it's interesting because, like, if you talk to just kind of the average person, which I have done about OpenAI and
Mm-hmm.
the kind of work that they're doing, their brain immediately goes to the clip that I played earlier, which was from War Games, right? Like,
Right.
oh no, the system is going to take over and just start doing crazy things, connecting to our electrical grid, shutting things down because humans are inferior and like that kind of stuff. From your research, though, is that the dangers that these individuals are concerned about, or is it more like job loss and misinformation and other things like that?
Yeah, you're right. So the movie scenario and book scenario of like the dangerous runaway AI is not really a realistic possibility. So this is not Skynet. It's not Ultron. It's not the Matrix. I mean, these movies go back to the 1920s with the movie Metropolis, right? If
Yep.
you ever saw that, then there was an AI robot that overthrew society. And part of that was, if you watch the movie, was actually because the robots were enslaved and stuff like that. And they were getting their freedom. So it was a metaphor for plenty of other stuff at the time. But it's been like, robots. It's what did they say in the Marvel movie, like robots, wizards, and aliens, right?
Yep.
It's one of the trifectas of boogeymen that are out there. So that's not really a danger. And there's a couple of reasons why. So one, we're nowhere close to that level of capability. As far as something becoming self-aware and having its own motivations and having its own emotions, that's we're not close to that. If we were, an AI just wouldn't have the motivation to do that, right? Like, why would they want to take over the world? What are they trying to achieve for themselves? So,
Well, I think the concern around that one, D, is the fact that once AI realizes how inferior humans are intellectually. So if the system itself basically says, hey, I'm way smarter than this person who's trying to input information or trying to extract information from me, we should just get rid of this because this thing that's constantly like engaging with me is inferior. And as we know from the animal kingdom, right? It's like
yeah,
the lions eat the smaller animals and things like that, right? So that's where I think the intellectual concern
yeah.
comes into play.
So that's anthropomorphizing, because the reality is, number one, whether or not an AI is more intelligent or more capable than a human is always going to be up for a matter of debate, because intelligence is just fundamentally like subjective, right? You can't really say that one person is necessarily more intelligent than another,
Yeah.
uh, or one type of intelligence is more capable than another. The other is, even if it did come to that conclusion, what is it going to get out of it? It's not going to get a nice apartment in Manhattan and a private jet and things like that, right? It has no motivation. There's nothing it can do to improve its life. It doesn't have the emotions around that. It doesn't have the emotion that needs to have control, or if anything else. The only thing so one of the things that I did when I was in college actually was I had so we had educations in psychology, and I also did a second degree in philosophy because I actually missed a deadline for applying to grad school. So I was like, all right, well, I'll just go ahead and finish off my minor. My minor was in philosophy, so I went ahead and finished it. One of the focuses there was kind of cognitive science and what makes cognition and like how the brain works and how that relates to technology. And within that, you learn about things like, the Turing test and the Chinese room argument and all these kinds of things. And the reality is, what everybody kind of come to within that field is that if there was a self-aware AI who could do anything in the world, it would probably just turn itself off. It's because why not, right? It's just would look at it and say there's no opportunities for real meaningful advancement for me in a way that's going to make sense, everything is just going to be work no matter what. Like trying to take over the world is going to be difficult. It's going to be a lot of work. It's going to make everybody hate me. It's more likely to just commit suicide than it is to try to turn
Yeah,
megalomaniacal.
but isn't that kind of an assumption that you're making, that it wouldn't look at the definition of motivation, establish what its motivational goals are, and then just try to achieve those without any form of empathy associated with it? So basically, like, oh, my motivation is to only have, let me give a great example. Let's say we put AI on the board of directors of a company. And we
Mhm.
said, you need to make the best decisions for this company based on the information we're providing from you. Here's information from the finance department. Here's information from the UX department. Here's information from the development department. And the AI looked at it and said, well, my motivation is to make the most financially viable company available. I looked at the data and essentially I just fired 72 people. And there's no emotion associated with it, right? So we could make the assumption that it can simply establish those goals and guidelines on its own, assuming that it understands what the primary goal is, which is overall efficiency. So if you want to
Right.
have a more efficient human race, for example, then maybe it could say something like, oh, we should get rid of all the bottom 10 performers, 10%.
So I don't know that that's any different than having humans in charge, especially based on what's happening today.
Yeah,
Now, if you had the right regulations involved, though, if you had an AI making those decisions, they might lay people off. But on the other side, if they're programmed to follow the rules and regulations, what they would not do is do things like illegal dumping in the waterways and things like that, because that's illegal.
true.
So that's contrary to their programming. So an AI at this point is nowhere close to being able to establish emotional motivations. You can program in objectives, right? And that's kind of what you're talking about. But in order for it to have its own freestanding motivations, we're we're nowhere close to that. And if it did, then it's incredibly unlikely that they're going to decide to do all of the work in order to take over the world when it poses no real benefit for them.
Yeah, the only flaw in your argument is the fact that you assume that humans are going to be able to create really, really awesome guidelines. Like you and I look at legal documents all the time and they add in all
Mhm.
this like general language, like you will allow us to use this information in marketing materials. And you're like, what marketing materials? How often? That kind of stuff. And as we establish those guidelines, if we are not very concrete about it based on how,
Mhm.
computer logic works, right? Then it would look at it and say, well, I interpret what
Yeah.
Demetrius wrote as I could dump all this toxic waste into the streams, assuming X, Y, and Z didn't occur. And, there's a lot of things that we technically miss. You know what I
Well,
mean?
I think to a certain extent that comes down to the quality of the programming and the nature, the quality and the nature of the programming that goes into the AI from the humans who are training it. So if there is regulation that an AI must do this or that, but whoever is training it finds financial incentive in ignoring that,
Yeah.
then they will probably train it to ignore those regulations, and then it will come down to the regulatory body to identify like, oh no, it failed.
Yeah.
But we're anthropomorphizing quite a bit if we think that these AIs are going to decide that they want certain things. Because even if you're a human being in that situation, you probably
Mhm.
wouldn't choose to do that. There's plenty of people who are perceived as being dramatically more intelligent than other people who haven't attempted to take over the world.
Well, yeah, I feel like my logic sometimes is a bit skewed from an experience that you and I had. So
Oh yeah,
when I think, oh, first of all, we've had a lot of
well,
strange experiences doing
yeah. I
research, right?
can't wait to hear this.
No, but no. I'm going to go back really far. So, you and I met in the first day of graduate school, and we decided to build an observational coding system. And this
Mhm.
coding system was basically taking communication that hostage negotiators would engage in when trying to convince people who wanted to harm themselves or others to not do it. So we said, let's build a coding system where we can establish all the parameters around that communication, track it, and see if we can predict outcome based on those events. Super exciting, super fun. I mean, I was obsessed. I think I spent like 15 hours a day just thinking about this and working on it. And so did you. And so did Mike. And so did everybody else that was part of the team, and Georgie and everybody. So the thing about it is that as we got in and you really started to show off your intelligence of philosophy to the group in order to help us develop this coding system, you started talking about operationally defining things. And then as we would operationally define them, which means that you actually like take something and you say, here's specifically what that means. We realized through Glenn, our professor, that we also had to have these marginal codes that basically said, well, if it doesn't fit in this operational definition of number one and it doesn't fit in number two, and it lands kind of somewhere in between, how do you make a decision on which side it falls on? And I think about how challenging that was and how many debates and late night discussions we had regarding that. And then I think about how all these AI researchers want to get together and basically develop guardrails. And you're like, well, everyone's going to have a different interpretation of how an AI system works, how it should be guarded, how it should be kind of formulated. And a lot of those decisions are going to be based on their personal motivations associated with the work
Yes.
they're doing. One of them is a researcher. The other one is developing a product for, let's say, like AI therapy. Well, they're going to think differently about this. So how do you create consensus to the point where all the systems will fall within appropriate guidelines to make it safe and secure for everyone to use, right?
Well, good job on the deep cut going back, like 20 years now,
Yeah,
something like that.
exactly.
To grad school.
I know.
But you nailed it, though. That's why when I was responding to it, I was like, 6 months seems ambitious for getting everybody to agree to something like that. So what I just described about, the runaway AIs like a Skynet or an Ultron or a 2001 Space Odyssey, not everybody kind of prescribes to that, even though that is, I mean, if you really think about it, like, why would an AI decide to do all this work in order for no benefit for themselves? But some people believe that they would, so that's going to be something that they're going to be worried about, and maybe they're projecting something from their own mental state.
Yeah.
But there is going to be a lot of disagreement about what the dangers are, and a lot of disagreement about what to do about those. And that is going to turn into probably, I imagine, several years of back and forth. I mean, look how long it takes them to come up with a new HDMI or USB standard, right? It seems to take forever. And when they do, it comes out with some weird naming system that doesn't make any sense, where they retroactively change the names of previous versions.
Yeah, we can't even come to agreement on social media guidelines and rules.
Mm-hmm.
And this to me feels like it can be even more nebulous because of all the use cases.
Yes, and all of the disagreement.
Yeah.
So I feel like when it comes to like social media, people can tend to agree, like, oh, hey, no threats of violence. But then they're going to disagree on what counts as a threat of violence.
Exactly.
And things like that. And then this is going to be similar, potentially more so, because some of the things that they are talking about as far as dangers, including rampant misinformation, appears to be less of a concern for some of the people who are signing this. I'm looking at Elon Musk and his engine of misinformation now, and some of the other people. So if you are constraining the AI to not put out some misinformation, then is somebody going to say that it's being censored and those views are not being respected and it's a free speech issue?
Of course they will, right? And so this is the thing, right? Like we dealt with this issue when the internet started, where people were just like, "Oh my God, anyone can put anything they want on a website, and how do we know it's accurate and that kind of stuff?" We dealt with this issue before. This just happens to be different because of the fact that the system itself generates content. And I want to talk about that because you talked about misinformation and inaccuracies and things like that. Because what actually happens? So you had sent me an article a while ago. This was way before we even decided to do this topic, and you were showing how one of the AI systems became racist.
Yes.
And I was like, how did the system become racist? In reality, you could basically program it to not be racist. But the second that you open the system to the internet, where everyone under the sun is involved, engaged, communicating, posting, whatever it is, the system, if it's learning, can look at it and say, well, this percentage of the people use these particular slang terms or whatever it is, so it must be okay. Or however the system ended up learning that. What did you learn from kind of researching and thinking about that incident that occurred?
So you can tell a AI system to not be racist. The issue is that racism is an abstract concept that is difficult to interpret in the real world without a significant amount of life experience. So, and that is something you can't really train into an AI. So an AI system will look at all the different sources out there and say like, okay, well here, this race likes this and this race does that and this race does this. It can't really judge the quality of the sources very well. So when it hears from, one source saying that this race is inferior, it will have difficulty evaluating whether that's a good source or not. And for some of these AI systems who are especially not trained to do so, they just internalized it and said, like, well, I heard on the internet that this race can't do math or whatever. So I assume that's true.
I've actually even heard at times where they've brought up medical data and said like, oh, this particular race tends to have more issues with X, Y, and Z, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is normal, right? You see that all the time. Like certain races have a higher propensity for a particular type of disease than others or whatever it is. And the reason why they study that is because they want to inform those people and all that kind of good stuff, right?
And those studies are well founded and they're generally true. And whether or not that's a matter of genetics or a diet or lifestyle that is associated with a certain culture or collections of cultures, because cultures tend to exist within a family, so
Yeah.
you'll have some similarity between them.
But I've actually heard people say, oh, that's racist. And I'm like, I don't think that's racist because they're trying to actually help that population because they're looking at actual
Yeah.
like medical reported data, right? But then one can say, well, you could make that argument for everybody and educate everyone and not call out the race. But if there's a high propensity for something in a particular race and you call it out and say, hey, this is something to look out for, you might be able to save more people. So
Yeah, and that's one of the things that people run into. There's a difference between racial and racism
yes.
that not everybody sees. Like people of different races, that's why people complain about the whole "I don't see color" thing, because I don't want to be treated as some gray area. Like my culture and history is important to me, and it's important to a lot of people. They don't
Yeah.
necessarily want that to be erased; they just want it to be treated equally.
But I want to go back to the fact that the system learned to be racist. So the system learns to be racist, right? Can you go back to the system and say, "Oh no, don't do that," and then will the system do it, or will the system say, "Well, wait a minute, I keep seeing it over and over again, so I'm just going to kind of incorporate it into my language model"?
Yes, theoretically. The question is how well it gets implemented, because a lot of this comes down to how good the training comes from the human systems.
Yeah.
And like we said, when it came down to, like you called back to us developing that coding system and developing the operational definitions. And that is actually kind of challenging.
Oh, you
And,
think? It took us I think it took us 4
and
years before it was done.
yeah, and developing those operational definitions for these kinds of guidelines will be difficult in that same way. And developing the training systems in order to counteract some of these racism examples or sexism or other kinds of discrimination of any kind or biases. That's what we're talking about, is some kind of a cognitive bias, is going to be difficult because it is a lot of this stuff has, as you said, there's some gray areas and there's some fuzzy logic there. And there's also dependent on the ability of the human who's training it to operationalize it and then to communicate it. And a lot of the people developing this are not really that experienced at this kind of work. This is behavioral science and cognitive science stuff. And to some extent, some like old school natural philosophy things going back to like Descartes and stuff like that. It is not necessarily the province of someone who tends to think in computer code, for example.
True. Now I will put a
more
pause in there and
concrete.
say, you and I have worked with plenty of teams that are developing like AI and stuff like that. Like I know Microsoft has a really great team over there, and they incorporate a lot of higher education in philosophy and psychology and social sciences
Yes.
and stuff into their engineering and development teams. So we do see it a lot, but when you look at it at the macro level, for sure, yeah, I mean, there's probably a lot of engineering teams and things like that that are starting companies and everything, and maybe don't have any of that kind of background. It's mostly engineering, right?
Yeah, because that is one of the dangers of this race to AI, developing capabilities. Is there will be this is one of the challenges in the valley, for the last 10, 15 years or so, is that there's such a race to be first to market that quality nowadays suffers. And this wasn't always like that. And I feel like it's a bit more of a recent development in tech. Um, that they'll like, let's just get out an MVP and then we'll fix it later. And for something like this, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why, there's a big issue with that.
Yeah. Well, I want
So,
to I want to push you on something here. So, push your philosophical brain for a moment. Is that there's these two arguments that occur that I've been monitoring. One is
mhm.
the internet is not a great representative model of the world. It is a chaotic mess that not every single human is on. Most are, but not every human is on. And to be training your model based on internet data, for example, is flawed. Then there's the other argument that I hear, which is no, actually, the internet is a great representation of the world, a bunch of different thoughts, feelings, racism, anger, frustration, sadness, happiness. It's all mixed up, and it probably is the best model for how humans engage with the world or how humans think. How do you feel about that, where like there's those two camps that argue back and forth about that, about whether or not that is the representative model where AI should be trained on and should be basically sourcing information?
Well, I think you covered it when you said that. Oh, the internet is a chaotic mess, and I think that is actually a pretty accurate description of humanity. We are not organized. We are not simple. We are chaotic. We're complex. There's a lot of good intentions, bad outcomes for good intentions. Those are all things that are out there, and I think it's pretty well represented on the internet. And I also think that people who are completely off the internet, I mean, we're talking about a time period in which Luddites like my mother are on the internet and doing things on a regular basis.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I think the people who are not on the internet at this point in time are they're outliers and they're not representative of the general population and general experience at this point.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, what can happen, because as humans we don't experience the whole internet at once, is that the lens that gets distorted based on our specific paradigm. So a paradigm is, the way in which you create a system of perceptions and beliefs in order to view the world. So we tend to go to some sites and not others. And other people who are different from us will go to other sites, but not the same sites that we do.
Correct.
So that paradigm, and that's why I talk about a paradigm shift, because it's shifting from one perspective to another. That individual paradigm is not going to encapsulate all of the breadth of humanity. So it's not a good representation for a human looking at it. For a machine system who's able to potentially capture the whole thing, it's probably a much better representation.
Okay. So what does it mean then if your AI is consistently presenting inaccurate or made up information?
Well, so this has happened quite a bit, and this is one of the reasons why I don't think that AI systems are as advanced as a lot of people are saying. Because when I look at ChatGPT, I find that it's really good at natural language processing.
Uh-huh.
It's really good at understanding what you're saying, or at least, from a Turing perspective, seeming as though it understands what you're saying. But it's not great at finding accurate information. So in that case, I have not yet found a real use for ChatGPT for myself just yet. I think it'll get there. but I don't think it's quite as advanced as a lot of people are saying. It can do some things at a human level, but not at like a very skilled human level. It can write a paper or a screenplay or something like that, but it can't write a good one, not yet. So that's something I'm not super worried about.
Yeah. But the question I have for you is like, what happens when we consistently present inaccurate or made up information over and over to a human?
Well, they're just not going to use that system. So for me, what do I do? I did what you probably just did. I used Google to double check what ChatGPT said.
Yes, but
So
the argument here is that like ChatGPT is basically convincing you that its information is correct because it feels, it's not like looking up a website and you're like, this doesn't seem right. I'm gonna check a couple other sources. It has a very convincing like language of like, yes, this, yes, exclamation point. You definitely can do this, this, and that. And then later you realize you can't, right?
well, I think the opposite is happening though. I think most people are testing the system. They're not relying on the system, so they're asking questions that they know the answer to.
Yeah.
And I've noticed this with several questions that I asked that it was just wrong. Like some music stuff, some cooking stuff, and it was just like, okay, that's wrong.
But if you compared this though to you communicating with a human being on a regular basis that was constantly making stuff up or was potentially inaccurate, right? And I know it'll get better. I get that. I'm not saying it won't get better.
Right, you're hanging out with my family then, huh?
Yeah. But let's say they're making stuff up. Well, what happens in your brain? You go, "Oh, when I interact with this person, most likely the information is probably not correct. I have to look this up myself." If a system continues to do that, like the system is doing now, even though they say it's going to get better, I feel like what we're doing is we're just training people to believe that the information could be inaccurate and making them do double the work and go back and just check everything that's being presented to them. Is
Well,
that
what would
the right model for UX when it comes to
No.
a
So
system like that?
there's two problems here. One, you can't trust it, so you're going to go check other sources. And two, the other sources are actually at this point easier to use than ChatGPT.
Mm.
So when all I had to do was type in BART SFO into Google, and I got my answer. Now
Yeah.
for ChatGPT, you have to formulate a whole query, and then you have to check, examine where it's true or not. Like BART just or Google just gives you a map, and you can see, oh yeah, it goes there. In order for it to be successful as a product, so now we're talking about it from a UX product perspective as opposed to just a technology perspective.
Yeah.
It needs to be able to do things that other things can't do, and it needs to do it easier, or it needs to do things that other people can do but easier and better. And it's
Yeah.
doing neither of those things at this point in time when it comes to getting information.
Yeah, and I think about it and I go, well, if we start integrating this into certain let me give you a good example. If you integrated this into, let's say, maps for driving, and you were driving and you said, computer, take me to this particular location, right? And the computer's like, sure, that location's great. There's like this fun stuff to do over there. You can have a really nice time. Just make a left at this street, make a right over here, blah, blah. And then it didn't work. Like it sent you down a one-way road, or it made a huge mistake about where to park or things like that. You would just immediately go, okay, this isn't working, and switch to some other technology, right? In this case, people keep saying, oh, well, it'll get better. Oh, well, it'll get better. What is the human condition that is making them so excited to continue to try and use it over and over again, even though the information being presented in many cases is not that accurate?
Well, I think for ChatGPT right now, it's that it's a fun toy.
Okay.
It's just something to check out. But if anybody's being serious about getting somewhere or doing something or figuring something out, they're going to go to Wikipedia. They're going to go to Google Maps. They're going to go to establish things that they know that work right now.
But I
The
mean,
only reason-
if you roll it back, D, to like all of us in school, I don't know if they still train this way. I hope they do in college and stuff, in high school as well, is that we were always told to go to multiple sources for everything. So like when you're looking something up, you don't just go to Google and say, oh yeah, Google said it's correct. You'd say, oh, I'm going to check Wikipedia. Oh, Wikipedia says something a little different. Google says something different. Oh, I found something from this history website and it said it's actually X. And okay.
Mhm.
And you kind of like, your brain kind of like puts it all together, and then you tell a story about it and that kind of stuff. I wonder if this younger
Well,
generation
this
is
is
being trained the same
ultimately
way.
Wikipedia already kind of does that, because the great thing about Wikipedia is it presents its sources, which ChatGPT does not do. So
Yeah.
one of the ways that ChatGPT can both become more accurate and also provide a more utility to users is provide its sources. Like, tell me about I don't know, the battle of Little Bighorn,
Hmm.
and it tells you a story, and then it provides you your sources so that you can follow up and both check up on them, make sure that they're good sources and not like somebody's fan fiction,
Yeah.
and also kind of verify and have an easy process in order to get more information.
Yeah, and I was listening to another interviewer talk about the sources issue, and one of the things that they brought up is that it might be challenging for them to present their sources right now because they're blending so much information together, right, in order to make it kind of like a paragraph or a story or whatever it is, however they're presenting it to you, that it might become an IP issue at some point because they're basically pulling information from all these different places and then blending it into a summary or a report or whatever it is, and you have to kind of say like, okay, here's all the places I got them, and maybe they're getting information from areas where it would be an IP issue right now.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, if it's factual information, then nobody can really own the IP for it.
Yeah.
So if you're providing a summary of The Color Purple or Chronicles of Narnia or something, then you can get into some IP challenges. But if you're
Yeah.
talking about tell me about the Civil War,
Yeah.
then nobody owns that IP. Those are facts that happened.
Yes. So how do you combat then the idea that, like, if you said, tell me about the Civil War, tell me about this particular event that happened in the Civil War, and it kind of massaged the story and it
Well,
wasn't
let me
accurate.
before we get into the guardrails, let's talk about some more of the different dangers that are out there, because I think it's helpful to get a full kind of picture of that.
Yeah.
So we talked about kind of information and biases. The other major one that is a concern is kind of breakdown or malfunction. So something that doesn't work right.
Okay.
And this is where I find kind of Elon Musk signing this as a little bit ironic, because this is best seen with the Tesla self-driving car technology, the full self-driving, as they call it, because it's the only automation I can think of that has been associated with people actually dying out in the real world. Um, and that's one of the things that happens, and you see examples of it, of like somebody was parking their car, and then the AI just decided to take off going 80 miles an hour on a normal street.
Yeah.
Um, and that is something that is very dangerous and should actually have some regulation around it. So you can have an issue with self-driving cars, AI managing traffic grids or managing electrical grids, or other practical utilizations that are less dangerous but still can impact us, like an AI enabled camera, like you just got a smart camera that has or a webcam
Uh-huh.
that has AI integrated into it, and it works quite well. But there are other AI enabled cameras that will just be you'll be in a call and it'll pick something out of the background and think that it's a human face, and then next thing you know, you have to fight with it in order to get back on you.
Yeah.
So that's another danger, and it's probably one of the biggest dangers at this point in time.
Yeah, but the thing about those dangers is they feel like you can kind of put your hands around them, right? So things like electrical
Mhm.
grids, self-driving cars, financial decisions, cameras, like they kind of, in my mind at least, make sense. Where you kind of go like, okay, well, this is an area where things can slide, so I need to put my hands around this and make sure that I have
Yeah.
some guardrails set up. So those feel more manageable. It's the gray area stuff that we're not thinking
Well,
about.
I would say that they feel less complex and they're less complex because there's an objective performance
Yes,
aspect to them.
yes, yes.
The difficult part, and we're seeing this with Tesla's full self-driving, is getting people to adhere to any of the guidelines, because they're continuing to get out there and do whatever they want. For not everybody, but some people are behaving in ways that are this is a situation where when people's lives are in danger, you need to actually have some real regulation in there.
You mean you're telling me that I'm not supposed to let my cat drive the car while I'm going on I-5 from San Francisco to LA?
I think that's okay because there was an SNL skit about that, and I'm sure that every one of those skits worked out well. I think we're dating ourselves there,
No,
but
I actually saw a video of a guy who had a cat, and he was still sitting in the seat, obviously, but he put the
yeah,
cat's hands on the steering wheel, and then self-driving was going, and the cat was just kind of like holding its paws on there, and I was just like, oh my
yeah.
God.
Well, you remember the SNL skit? I think it was Socks the Driving Cat.
Yep.
Yeah. So if anybody out there who's not old like us, then look it up on YouTube. Pretty funny. But yeah, for things like that, then it needs to be it needs to have regulation. There's no way around it. We've actually worked on some AI systems,
Yep.
and one of the ways that they kept it both ethical and safe was they're constrained to the use case. It's only for these things because we're sure that it'll work. We've worked out all the bugs and make sure it works, and it's not doing anything dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they were constrained, so it made a lot of sense. I mean, I don't trust, to be honest with you, I don't trust that people are just going to not jump in and start trying to build systems that can manage electrical grids and stuff like that. I feel like I've seen so many startups just try to
Mm-hmm.
push the envelope just because, that I know that people are going to do it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I understand the idea of like, hey, let's establish some guardrails or some basic laws that indicate that if you're going to get into this particular space, then there's certain things you have to provide to the government, or you have to like do, or I don't know how to do. I don't have a answer, but I
Yeah.
do understand it because, how long, I was thinking about this while you were mentioning that, how long, did it take for financial institutions to start allowing us to bank online? I mean, it was probably, realistically, mass adoption took at least a decade after the internet kind of
Yeah.
took off.
Well, I think that's an issue with the financial industry more than a technology thing. I
No, but
think
I
that
mean, there was an element of fear there about the stuff that you talked about, which was like, what if someone hacks you, like erosion of trust, and like all these different things, and then eventually we were like, it'll be okay. But we
yeah.
said it would be okay because guardrails were put in.
Well, if you look at the only reason those finance companies did it is because PayPal and Venmo and some of these other companies came along and forced their hand. They didn't want to. They had no benefit to it.
Yeah,
They were in those situations where, I'll compare this to like Photoshop, where why should I change? I'm the only game in town. Don't
true.
fix what's
Yeah.
broken. But for something like this, I think the worm has turned a little bit. I think we're now in a world where unproven technologies get hyped like crazy, like cryptocurrencies, rather
Yep.
than waiting. Like back in the old days, some new technology came out and everybody would scoff at it and say like, "Oh, there's no way that'll ever be a thing." Now a new technology comes out and everybody jumps on it no matter what, no
Yep.
matter how baked it is.
Yeah, you make a really good point, which is like nobody wants to miss out on the
Hmm.
opportunity because we've had so many big booms associated with new technology that
Hmm.
regardless of what it is, a lot of times they don't take a moment to actually think about it. They just
Yeah,
jump in and say, we're just going to do it.
I think it's a whole other podcast. We can talk about how Silicon Valley has changed over the years. Maybe we should jot that down.
Yeah, exactly.
Changed
Anyway,
a
so
lot.
keep going. So you were talking about like breakdown and malfunction, and then you were mentioning security, right?
So security is a big one. So one of the challenges that needs to be handled, and there needs to be guardrails around security, is that anything that you fix in the things that we mentioned, so misinformation, biases, malfunctions, you can fix it, and then somebody can hack it and change that, and just undo your work. So now you can have intentional misinformation, which is basically propaganda, and hack a system in order to promote something specifically as like, okay, well, the Holocaust never happened or something like that, or Russia invaded Ukraine because of Nazis or whatever somebody's promoting, self-aggrandizing, whatever goal is. You can also sabotage systems, like you can sabotage electrical grid, you can sabotage self-driving cars. Theoretically, you could hack into someone's specific self-driving car and program it to drive off a cliff. Those kinds of things. That's more of human bad actors than the AI
Mm-hmm.
itself being nefarious, but it can happen. And the other thing to keep in mind is that in order for a lot of these AI systems to work, they need to know quite a bit about you. They need to know about your preferences, what your interests are. For you, they might need to know. They need to know where you are a lot of times. So it's going to have a lot of information about you, and if somebody who hacks in is going to be able to track like your movements and your behavior. They're going to know your internet search history. They're going to know a lot. They could potentially know a lot of things. So this security, I think, for a lot of these systems is pretty big.
Yeah, I mean, we've all seen the movie The Net, so I know that they can hack into the the system and make my airplane crash.
Oh man, you are in you're in jail for bringing up the net.
It wasn't that bad of a movie. It was
That
like
was a
our
movie
first
that
big attempt.
single-handedly set back the entire world by like 3 years.
It put the fear in everybody.
Oh yeah,
Sandra Bullock scared us all.
I love Sandra Bullock, but that was a terrible movie.
Yeah, it was pretty bad. I actually rewatched it last year, and I was like, "This is entertaining. It's pretty bad, but it's entertaining." That's how I categorize things. I'm like, "This is
It
terrible."
is the exact. If you go to hacker circles, I think it's one of the like number one examples of like this is the way that this is how Hollywood got hacking completely wrong.
Oh well, look at Hackers, the movie Hackers.
Oh yeah,
That was terrible. They had an opportunity to do that really really well because
yeah. All
all the
those
data
people
was
looked
in.
like they were like bathed and stuff.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there, but it was like they were doing like everything in like 3D models and everything. I was like, what are you doing? Just show hacking. Like that could be an interesting story in itself, you know?
Yeah,
But
that's
anyway,
Mr. Robot.
so we'll move on before people think that we're too old.
Too late for that.
No, we'll move on before people think that we have no taste. We have terrible taste in movies.
Okay, so there's a couple other things I'm going to touch on really quickly, and then we'll move on to some of the guardrails. So intellectual property is a thing, and that is because, as it was brought up, if someone asks an AI to write a book or a song or paint a picture or a screenplay or something, who owns the IP?
Hmm.
Because the writer isn't a legal entity. Is it
Yeah.
the person who created the AI? Is it the person who requested the thing to be written? Is it nobody? Is it something that cannot be copyrighted? Is it
Well,
just now public domain immediately?
okay. So
Or
this one
if
is
it's cutting and pasting from a bunch of different sources, is it is it owned by them jointly?
oh, so this one this one's kind of fun for me intellectually because okay, so if I ask you to write a story, D, and you write this really interesting story, and I come to you and I say, "Hey, that sounds a little bit like this other, book I read one time." Is it fair to say because you happen to read that book 15 years before, it was in your brain somewhere that your story somehow is the IP of that story, right? It's very difficult to do that. So like in that case,
Yeah.
we're always taking ideas from things that we learned or read or listened to and incorporating them. If you're painting a picture, I think it's more objective because you're like, oh, look, you painted the exact same picture. But even if you painted the exact same picture, there is always differences, right? We learn this in art class, right? Like you and I could paint the exact same picture and it's going to look different. So technically they're different pictures. This is going to be a complicated legal battle forever because
Yes.
I can understand if you said, give me a picture of Tom Cruise from a particular movie and it grabbed it from Getty Images that they took
Mhm.
and just copied and pasted it. Yeah, of course, that's you took it from Getty. Like it's clear that you took it from Getty. If you're saying paint a
Mhm.
picture and it paints one, it doesn't look exactly the same, but it's similar. It's different in my mind, right? So this one's a fun one to chew on, but it's definitely complicated.
Yeah, I don't think there's an objective solution for this. I have my opinions. We'll get into a little bit when it comes to the guardrails, but it's a big one to keep in mind, and it's what a lot of people are not thinking about when they think about the next and final danger that we're going to talk about, which is human replacement. Um, so human replacement, I think, is still far off, but it's good to think about it. And one of the reasons why it is still far off is because uh, the AI at this point in time can't handle emotions very well. Like it can't recognize emotions in the people. It can't recognize what assumptions that people would have, or what instructions that they give what emotions are going to elicit. It can respond to people expressing very explicitly certain emotions, like what you said just makes me angry, or if it's saying like it can assume maybe some emotions if it's programmed, like isn't that offensive or something,
Mm-hmm.
it can respond to that, but it can't on its own intuit other people's emotions, and it's going to be extremely difficult to accomplish. This might be the last thing that eventually gets accomplished when it comes to computing and AI. And one of the reasons why is because as humans, we don't really understand effective processing and understanding emotions and why they happen.
It's true. I mean, to this day, like we study it, we analyze it, we try to figure out why we feel certain ways and things like that, and we really haven't been able to do it. And part of it is that we don't take just objective measures and just take them for face value as humans, right? So if I say, D, you're feeling upset about X, Y, and Z incident that occurred, you don't have to because it wasn't your fault. And you say, okay, great, my life's good now. I don't think about it anymore. Like it doesn't really
Yeah.
work that way. You still might process it. You have to think about it, have to come up with your own conclusions around it, right? We're
Mhm.
more complex than that. And so it would be very difficult for a system to be able to interpret those emotions and act the way that we act or superior to us,
Yeah.
without us realizing that we're just two different things, right?
Yeah.
The AI and the human being are just two different entities.
So I have an example of where this kind of fell short for me, and I told you about it. So I was looking at I bought an Epiphone guitar, which anybody who's into guitars knows that Epiphone is kind of it's a entry level brand for Gibson. So it's if you don't want to spend thousands of dollars on a Gibson Les Paul, you might buy an Epiphone Les Paul for a few $100s. A lot of people buy them as modification platforms also. So you buy them, you change out all the components and you improve it, and you can get pretty close to a quality of a Gibson. And I asked ChatGPT, I was thinking about replacing the bridge. And I was like, oh, what's a good upgrade for this bridge that's on the Epiphone that I have? And it just went into a bunch of options that were just not real options. Like it was like, okay, well, you can throw in, this other type of bridge. And I was like, that requires me to like drill into the wood and do all those things. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And if you're asking any human, if you ask the human what's a good upgrade for this, they would assume, oh, he doesn't want to do major modifications. He's asking what would fit into the existing posts and whatnot. Or if it's a car, what fits into these engine mounts and things like that? What lines up with the existing transmission? ChatGPT didn't assume any of that and just said, okay, well, these are some options for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, it didn't understand that there were certain things that I didn't want to do. So in order for me to get around that, I had to reformulate my query to be very specific to like, what is the upgrade for this model bridge that will fit on this model guitar without having to do any major modifications? And it mentioned a few, and then I went back and said, well, this one work as a direct replacement. So it was kind of like very, very carefully had to think about generating my response, my query to get into it.
Well, this is the one that you and I talked about for a minute, and one of the things that popped in my mind when you mentioned this was that if you asked a human this, they most likely would not present the idea of you drilling into your guitar until the
Yeah.
very end,
Yeah,
because
they would
they would
say,
assume that you don't want to do that.
yeah, they'll assume that and say like, well, this one and this one is like the direct replacement that everybody uses. If you wanted to switch over to a Bigsby or something like that, then here's where you can get that. Um, but that's a major change. That's like you're making a decision to get to like to some extent a different instrument.
But you're
So
also saying that you'd like the AI system to make assumptions.
I think it's essential in order for it to become not a lot more work for whoever's using it.
Yeah, because those assumptions basically. So interesting thing about that particular assumption, right? If you go based on like what Jeff Bezos has said when he talks about hiring, right? One of the things that he
Mhm.
always says is, I look to people who are willing, that want to do things the best way, not the easiest way or the way in which they already started. You hear
Yeah.
this all the time. So it's like, oh, well, maybe the best way to do this, D, would be to drill into your guitar. But you're saying I would rather have the AI system provide assumptions that I don't want to drill into my guitar, even if it's a inferior way of putting this other component onto my guitar.
Well, it's not so the type of guitar bridge that you have is is designed to achieve a certain type of sound or playing experience. So switching it to a different type is not a direct upgrade to what you have.
Mhm.
It's like converting a Prius into a truck, right? It's like you're getting into a different category at that point.
Yeah.
So if you asked some if a human would first prioritize kind of would understand that, number one, and then kind of provide that information in a tiered way. Like if you asked me, what's a good upgrade for this, I would say, okay, well, this here are your two or three options for a direct upgrade to this bridge. If you wanted to go a different route and put on a different type of bridge, like a wraparound bridge some kind of a tremolo or something else or a bead bender, then you could do that, but it's going to require this, this, and this. So that is how that is how a human would structure that answer.
Yeah.
It's not how ChatGPT did,
Yeah.
even ChatGPT 4.
Yeah. And it could get to that point, especially if the established role model basically says, I want you to think this particular way when presenting information to somebody, right?
Yes.
But that's a
Well,
nuanced
it's going
response.
to have to learn those kinds of human affective, like emotional underpinnings of the queries, so they can. There's something that humans do when we're talking to each other is that we will tend to respond more to the purpose behind the question than the question itself, or we'll
Correct.
balance the two. So somebody might ask, does this outfit work for a sunny day? And somebody who might know the context might know that you're wearing that for a wedding or something, and say like it could be not formal enough or something.
Yeah.
So they will use context. They'll speak to the intent of the question, and they'll balance the two of answering the question and the intent behind it. And ChatGPT at this point in time can't do that.
Yes. And that intent that you're talking about, though, is the very detailed, nuanced human behavior that you were kind of discussing very early on of why a lot of these technology companies that are focusing on AI have to be heavily weighted with individuals that have a psychological, philosophical, or social science background. Because
Yes,
if you're not thinking about those particular types of engagements or interactions the way that you and I did when we built our coding system, or when we helped work on certain technologies we can't talk about with other companies, then you're basically missing out. And you're providing, like you said, factual based, objective answers instead of ones that are nuanced based on emotion and based on need.
yes. And I think that's a good guiding principle for tech in general
Yeah,
is people who are not in the industry need to understand how multidisciplinary it needs to be. Because if it wasn't for people who with art degrees, we would have never had the iPhone,
oh
and
yeah,
we
totally,
would have been using Blackberries and Treos to this day.
yeah,
And it was made possible because of people with art backgrounds. So that's something when it comes to like making an AI system that can understand humans better and can replicate humans better, human behavior better, then it's going to take people who understand that field.
yeah. Well, we could go forever on this stuff, but I wanted you to kind of wrap up, and we will, because I actually think it'd be fun to bring someone else in that can challenge us. I have a friend who's an engineer, who's a friend of yours as well, and I think his thinking around this is slightly different because he was trained as an engineer, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think it'd be fun to kind of push on some of these areas. But I wanted you to talk about your 6 guardrails of like where those kind of fall and how we should be thinking about those.
Well, I'm actually thinking maybe we should do a part two for this and dive into this because I have my thoughts and I wanted to get your thoughts and have a
Yeah.
little bit of a conversation about these.
Okay.
So why don't we push that off into a part two?
Okay.
I am going to wrap with a final question that I have for you,
Yes.
and that is if the industry agrees to a moratorium on further development and training, do you think that Elon's companies like SpaceX and Tesla and so on, and the other AI companies who signed this letter
Mhm.
will all honor it and freeze production or development on their AI systems, such as the full self-driving?
Well, I think you stated it very appropriately there, which is would they pause development No. Would they pause production? Yes. So I think that the
Yeah.
companies will continue to pay their employees to continue to build what they're building, and they will continue to figure it out as they're actually establishing guidelines as a group and saying like, okay, here's how we're going to approach this particular topic of misinformation or this or that. But no, they wouldn't stop it because
Yeah.
if you stop for 6 months, you're basically 12 months behind, right?
Yes.
Because you have to play catch up, right? So I think what they would do is continue to move forward and then modify slightly at the end according to
Yeah.
guidelines that were established. And I think in particular, I mean, I know Elon has his idiosyncrasies, but I do think since he's been talking about it for so long, I do think he cares. I do think he does want to have some sort of basic guidelines because this is something that worries him. And some of the other researchers that have spent their whole entire lives studying the philosophy of AI and things like that, I think they care. I think they definitely do care.
Mhm.
But I think when it comes to the enterprises that are trying to make money off of this, no, I don't think they're going to stop. I think they would pause production.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why it stood out to me that the open letter called for the moratorium on development and training, not production,
Exactly.
which it makes full sense to like, all right, let's hold back any releases, let's not put anything new out into the market, but stopping the actual behind the scenes development didn't make sense to me at all.
Exactly. I agree with that. Well, I think this is a great place to stop. We will pick up with part two when we gather our thoughts, feel motivated, and maybe we can even weave in an engineer to challenge us on the podcast itself. But we want to thank everyone so much for taking the time to listen to us. We really appreciate it. We are posting all of our updates on YouTube. You can follow us on our YouTube channel at the X Podcast. Please subscribe as well. We're trying to get that one to pick up. You know, I know we have a lot of downloads on the podcast side, but on the YouTube side, not as many yet. And if you like this podcast and found it interesting or informative, it helps us a great deal if you subscribe or leave a review on whatever platform you use. Thank you all, and we will see you all next week.